If you were to ask around during the Renaissance about who the great sorcerers of recent times were, a few names would probably be bandied about. Of course, everyone would mention the great ancient sorcerers, Zoroaster, Hermes, and Solomon. Isidore of Seville and St. Augustine might even get studiously quoted in their definition of magic and their history of the origins of magic. But more recently, however, well, the author of the Picatrix certainly, and maybe someone like Tos Graecus. That name is probably a strange corruption of Thoth the Greek. They would all likely come up to my mind along with the mysterious followers of the Kabbalah, only at that point recently known in Latin. But many would know of the shadowy books of magic passing through the necromantic underground, books for summoning spirits into a magic circle, creating a range of illusions, and producing rings of necromantic power deep into the night. And I think one name would no doubt emerge. He had been twice tried by the Inquisition, once acquitted and once being saved basically by his own death. Nevertheless, some might recall how the Dominicans attempted to exhume his bones in order to burn them, and yet they were all strangely missing from his crypt, stolen away by friends, or perhaps something more mysterious yet. They might recall how in his most famous public work, assuming they had really read it, a vast tome attempting to bring current medical theory, scholastic philosophy together with astrology and natural magic by his own admission, hinted vaguely at the production of astral talismans and how the power of incantations was discussed at length in that work, one of the longest discussions in public about the nature of magic from the medieval period. Asking about the greatest medieval sorcerer, I strongly suspect the name that you'd hear the most would have been that of Pietro of Abano, Peter of Abano. But was he a sorcerer at all? Let's explore what little we know about his life, his vast public productions, which, by the way, do skirt right up to the edge of astral necromancy at times, and some of the books of magic condemned as written by him by the Inquisition, who burned him allegedly in effigy. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support the work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this, well, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon, where you can support me with a small monthly donation, or pick up a cool piece of merch on the channel, some cool black metal style merch. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to kind of get the lay of the land from reliable sources, well, check out my study guide. You can find that link below. And if you're interested in actual historical books of magic and the occult, you can check out my bookstore over at Esoterica Rare Books. Again, you can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's explore the life, works, and yes, perhaps the magic of one who became one of the great, if not the greatest sorcerer, at least by reputation, from the Middle Ages, Peter of Abano. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Writing in 1625, Gabriel Nadet composed a substantial volume attempting to show that many great people in history had been falsely accused of having been sorcerers. From Pythagoras and Socrates to Solomon and Thomas Aquinas, Nadet methodically works through these historical figures to show that they were innocent of the taint of depraved and superstitious sorcery. Of the men that he defends, he sought to defend Peter of Abano, who, according to Nadet, was, among the most common opinions, himself the greatest magician of the age. Most people agreed that he was the greatest magician of the Middle Ages, whose great learning in the seven liberal arts were in fact due to his power over having 7 demons trapped in a crystal. So that's kind of Final Fantasy-ish. He could even cause spent money to reappear in his purse. Indeed, Michael Savonarola, grandfather to that apocalyptic prophet Savonarola, writing about a generation after Peter's death, that his teachings on magic in fact rounded out his overall philosophy and his medical practice, making him all the more illustrious. He had mastered everything from medicine to magic. He was among the few scholastics that was in fact spared from the unending invective of the Renaissance humanists, who declared him an illustrious genius, a prodigy, and a miracle in an otherwise rude and unhappy age. Peter of Abano himself and the handful of magical works attributed to him have gone down as one of the greatest magical texts and greatest magicians of the Middle Ages. And yet, until recently, his works, his actual known works, have proven obscure in the extreme. Yet, in the past 20 years or so, there's actually been a resurgence of studies on Peter, with monograph-length studies appearing in at least some sections of his vast works, appearing in critical editions and translations for the first time in modern history. With scholarship now starting to catch up to legend, what can we actually say about the life, works, and the alleged sorcery of Peter of Abano? Probably born in the 1250s. That time, by the way, the north rose window of Notre Dame Cathedral was completed around then, bringing major construction then to a completion, and Thomas Aquinas himself was just starting his illustrious career in Paris. To get you a sense of when we are in time, Peter was born into a family of apparently some means and was able to secure a relatively great education, in fact, a superb education. He would ultimately travel to Constantinople and become one of the few Europeans able to both read and translate authors such as Aristotle in their original Greek. By 1300, he was over in Paris, because of course he was. He became a doctor of philosophy and medicine and was actually hailed as the great Paduan, even referred to as the second Aristotle, completing his vast masterpiece, the Consiliator, in around 1303. Around this time, he had the chance to talk to the great travelogue Marco Polo around 1310, and eventually he would refer to Padua. He was in fact curious to talk to Marco Polo about whether or not there were people who could live below the equator. So there he would earn a substantial salary as a doctor, treating aristocrats and popes. Yes, he treated popes alike. Indeed, his famous work on poisons may in fact be dedicated to John the 22nd, an ironic fact considering that that very pope truly opened the assault on sorcery and alchemy in the late Middle Ages. Peter is infamously said to have run afoul of the Inquisition twice. However, the exact nature of his alleged heresies remains unclear to this day. After describing astrological influence on historical epochs in his magnum opus, Peter complains of being vexed by those with an apostolic mandate, frankly unable to understand his teachings in the first place. Thus, by 1303 in Paris, perhaps, his astrological theories had already attracted inquisitorial notice. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to attract inquisitorial notice. His works, however, are peppered with all the standard nods toward orthodoxy. One Thomas of Strasbourg did accuse Peter of heresy after he was dead, specifically claiming that Peter said that Jesus actually didn't raise people from the dead. Rather, they were just suffering from an illness which made them appear dead. They were in a coma or something, such that Jesus healed them, but they were still alive. Peter, for his part, at least from my knowledge, never says anything to that effect in his writings, and even the narratives of these inquisitorial proceedings varies widely from author to author. It does seem like he was accused and acquitted in at least one instance, however. The other is far from clear. Some historical accounts claim that Peter died during the second proceedings, but was eventually found guilty. Yes, you could be found guilty after your death, and rather than being burned alive, he was burned in bone. They actually burned his bones in public, according to this one. Another tale has his bones being hidden away by his friends and his housekeeper, Peter only being burned in effigy. However, more recent research seems to indicate that his heirs did in fact inherit his sizable estate, and as you may know, the estates of convicted heretics were actually seized by the Inquisition, which of course didn't lead to any form of corruption in church history ever, and that his heirs did in fact inherit his estate complicates his further fate. So we don't know exactly what happened to him. Regardless of his ultimate fate, he did seem to have died, maybe sometime between 1315 and 1318. Of course, death is a very minor inconvenience on the road to becoming a legend, and so we have to wonder, how did Peter of Abano come to be known as such a legendary sorcerer just shortly after his own death? This lies first in his great learning, which even his enemies had to admit, and specifically on his reliance on astrology from everything from his medical practice to his theory of history. That latter bit, astrology and history, would teeter pretty closely onto heresy. Of course, I can't cover all of Peter's works in this episode, but I do want to focus in on the elements that contribute to his reputation as a sorcerer. But suffice to say, they are substantial and virtually unknown today outside of a tiny handful of specialists. There are basically no modern editions, and they've certainly never been translated to modern languages. However, he is said to have translated astrological works of Ibn Ezra. He produced a work of physiognomy. He produced a text of the Problems of Alexander of Aphrodisias, a translation of Galen's therapeutic method, his magnum opus, the Conciliator, in 1303, a text on the astrolabe and the eighth motion of the fixed stars, another major text on astrology, the Lucidator, in 1310, a commentary on the Problems of Aristotle. You're getting the picture, right? Just a guy wrote a ton. Additions to the Arabic astrology of Ibn Masawiyah, Dioscorides De Materia Medica, a translation of Pseudo-Hippocrates, and a work on geomancy. You can see where the magic's starting here. And of course, his famed work on poisons. Of course, this should be added to his alleged works of necromancy, which I'm going to return to a bit. Most of these remain, as I said, in manuscript. Most of them have never been printed, but virtually none of them have had modern editions, much less full translations. Thus, gaining an overall portrait of Peter's thought is difficult to say the least. However, recent studies, especially about his astrological medical theories and his potential relationship to sorcery, have given us a much, much better ability to understand the historical Peter of Abano, along with the legends that have grown up around him. While considered esoteric these days, astrology was just par for the course of a medieval higher education and simply a university course that you could take back in the day. However, astrology did open the door to a specific set of heresies which had to be avoided. Among them were the idea of astral fate determining individual human natures. This would eliminate the free will so central to Christian soteriology, identifying and manipulating the planets as self-moving astral intelligences. This is sometimes referred to as astral necromancy, especially arguing that historical events, especially events in religious history, were the result of astral determination. For instance, certain conjunctions inducing the coming of Christ or Moses, which would in effect rob history of its direct involvement by the divine. Further, judicial astrology, or especially horoscopes on the ultimate fate of monarchs or popes, was all a big no-no. And in all these cases, astrology, which was properly taken to be signs or portents of what was to come, was extended to, in fact, said to have caused those outcomes, and thus free will, divine sovereignty, or the regular functioning of the cosmos, in the case of astral necromancy, constituted heresy. That's where you couldn't cross over things. You could say that they were signs in the heavens, but not that they caused much in the way down here. Further, the concept of creating talismans or objects infused with special astral powers was also suspect because it takes for granted that astral rays, a la Al-Kindi or pseudo-Al-Kindi, I suppose these days, are actually causative in nature and not merely semiotic. And on virtually all of these counts, Peter of Abano comes right up to the razor's edge of heresy on almost every point. In fact, well over in some cases. But to appreciate that and how he tiptoed around this, assuming he did manage to tiptoe around it, I mean, he was tried for heresy at least once and maybe twice after all, we have to appreciate his central work, the Consiliator. Now, this thing is a beast spanning hundreds of pages printed in dense type, at least in 16th century editions, and it covers over 200 questions or differentiae in which Peter deploys the scholastic method of disputation to try to settle those questions. That is to say, Peter is attempting to tackle hundreds of unsettled topics in medicine, very generally understood, bringing to bear Aristotelian philosophy, natural magic, previous medical theories and practice, along with astrology into one vast synthetic analysis. As I said, he proceeds by the method of scholastic disputation, a method that I frankly have a lot of sympathy for, but which can be exhaustively daunting if you're not familiar with how it works. Well, this is how it works. First, he provides the question, and then he provides arguments in the defense of answers he disagrees with, followed by his own answer, followed by arguments which support his answer, and then finally arguments against the positions that he started with. That is to say, he provides defeats for the arguments against his position that he started with. Thus, the Consiliator seeks to reconcile medical problems on a wide range of disputed issues, from how many elements there are, what's the purpose of blood, is there life below the equator? That's what he asked Marco Polo about, he would know. Does death occur more often by day or by night? When should you take your meals? Does all curing occur through therapy? By contrary, does sleep help with curing? What do you do during treatments during the critical days of what we now know of as malaria, etc., etc.? Now, remember those specific places where medieval alchemy butted up against heresy? Well, as I said, Peter wades into all of those waters and more. For instance, in Differentia 10, Peter argues that while God can directly interfere with nature, those are just miracles, divine causation is otherwise always performed through a medium. What's that medium? Astral causation. Indeed, he relies on the authority of none less than Enoch and Hermes for just such an opinion. Astrology itself works through logical and mathematical precision, unlike other debased forms of divination for Peter, and further, the occult virtues in natural objects, such as metals, herbs, and gems, are not due to some a priori nature of those gems, etc., but to astral infusion, and thus there is no natural magic without astrology. And just as studying the heavens can help predict for what you do with negotiating with the weather, so too can the astral weather, the astral conditions, predict for things like diet, when to do bloodletting, purgatives, and other kinds of therapies. Thus, there is truly no medicine for Peter of Abano without astrology. Indeed, one can't even truly perform accurate medicine on a patient without detailed knowledge of that patient's nativity, as one medicine will operate differently from character to character, and such character is in fact always induced through astral conditions at birth. Now, much of this is par for the course in terms of medieval astrological medicine, and very few specific elements of these positions on astrology would bring Peter over the line into heterodoxy. But when taken cumulatively, the situation looks less and less orthodox. This is especially the case in his discussions on the nature of the astral intelligences. Now, the planets move through the night sky. Indeed, their movements are odd, hence their name, planet, from planestae. They wander through the sky. They even seem to go backwards sometimes. But given medieval philosophical commitments, such movement must either be explained as them being moved or them moving themselves, autolocomotion. A going theory is that they were actually just moved by very specific angels tasked by God to shove them through the night sky. Easy enough. Another is that they were self-moved and thus intelligent. But of what kind of intelligence are these planets? Often the intelligence theory and the angelic movement theory were just collapsed, such that the intelligence of the planet is just that angel assigned to it. And if planets emit powerful astral rays, then their intelligence could be called upon to act in specific manners. This manipulation of angelic planetary intelligence has become known as medical astral necromancy, or just astral necromancy simply, and was grounds for execution for heresy. And in fact, I've done an entire episode on Cecco d'Ascoli, who was in fact executed on just those grounds a bit after Peter of Abano. As for Peter, he's pretty subtle. He notes that the planets must be intelligent in some sense and just leaves it at such. And yet, just a chapter before that, repeats the famous position of Averroes with the traditional association of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, and Mercury, and the Moon, of course, with the angels, Cassiel, Sachiel, Samael, Michael, Aniel, Raphael, Gabriel, respectively. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It's astral necromancy. Honestly, I feel like the more that you just scratch on these medieval astrological texts, it's just necromancy right there below the surface. Further, he admits of the efficacy of astrological images or talismans, following in the magical tradition of writers like Thabit ibn Qurra, who I've also done an episode on, such that you make an image of a scorpion made as the moon leaves Scorpio, and it can treat things like stings. You can use images which infuse a person with the astral rays of their nativity, and that can be used to lengthen their life. And Peter actually just admits to having made and used such talismans in his medical practice. But again, these discussions are spread through this vast work at Differentiae 9, 10, 16, 64, 101, 113, thus making it difficult to pin Peter down to an exact statement of heresy. And to this, he seems to add and indicate that specific astrological conjunctions actually herald vast movements in theological world history. This is especially true for him of the cyclical conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter in Aries, which are said to produce prophets introducing new laws or religions in teaching sages and men. Such men are said to be somewhere between sages and angels. And he quotes, while not verbally agreeing, that such conditions actually produced men such as Christ and Moses. Again, this is dangerous territory because it has astral conditions, not divine will, directing theological history. Now again, Peter says, I'm just quoting authorities on this and not saying it myself, but indeed, such astral cycles produced all of the golden ages, all the great philosophers, the empires, and their leaders. So just where is free will in any of this? And further, when do we actually know what Peter's position is? He often remains ambiguous, and thus it's very easy to project into his silence everything from perfidious heresy to an invitation to indulge in astral necromancy. And it's that subtlety, as we might call it, that is most on display in the infamous Differentia 156, in which Peter discusses the nature and power of incantations. He introduces a range of definitions for the nature of incantations, most of them pretty deprecative as nonsense words allegedly capable of non-local and frankly astounding effects. However, he both rejects that incantations have power in themselves, and he also rejects the idea that they have no power at all. They can't have power in themselves because words can't cause changes in things not in their species, per good old-fashioned Aristotelian reasoning. But insofar as they work, how do they work? Because they correlate with another causal agent, specifically through spiritual or mental causation, astral causation, or some other form of occult causation, the agent intellect, always the agent intellect in the Middle Ages, and finally with either demonic or divine causation. In the first case, incantations work through the process of what he calls fascination, what we might now call hypnosis or the power of suggestion. If a patient is especially hopeful and trusting, and the doctor is especially confident and assertive, then an incantation will coincide or amplify either natural realignment of the humors or other treatments. It's something like the placebo effect as we understand it now, plus the power of positive thinking, plus hypnosis. Secondly, other occult forces may co-align with the incantation to work some kind of effect. But while Peter expresses skepticism of the various forms of exorcisms or necromancies or suffumigations associated with the necromantic magic of his time, he does double down on the importance of incantations per se. Indeed, in Differentia 113 and 156, he actually details his own success with an astrologically timed invocation to the divine to gain wisdom. He further notes the liturgical use of the Eucharist, the power of the Eucharist through the incantation, the magical power of the Ars Notoria, where nomina barbara are repeated while meditating on magical signs to supernaturally gain rapid wisdom, along with how incantations apparently allow people to do things like walk across hot coals, walk across sharp knives, endure torture or injury without even wincing. Others allow people to charm serpents and break horses. They can treat epilepsy, and all kinds of great feats of strength are achieved. You can even extract arrows out of a bone without the person expressing the least bit of pain. But how? The incantation either induces otherwise normal, untapped mental or spiritual strength, or it correlates to specific astral conditions, underlying occult forces, or some form of causation performed by demonic or divine forces, or again, the agent intellect. Thus, incantations are historical accretions atop otherwise instances of real causal power. They are the magical version of correlation doesn't mean causation. Peter even recounts the tale of a lord who taught an unlearned peasant woman the incantation Dua et tria constituit quinque et tria similiter et duo, just to mock her because she didn't have any Latin. It just means, by the way, that 2 and 3 make 5, like 3 and 2 do. But thinking her a witch after he actually got a fish bone stuck in his throat, he realized that she didn't know any other magic other than that silly incantation he taught her. But the incantation was all so hilarious to him that he broke out in laughter, a laughter that in fact dislodged the bone from his throat. And this all well makes Peter's point. The ambiguity of the causal power of the incantation again becomes a site of projection by his reader. Correlation isn't causation, sure, but of course, poisoning and sorcery have been linked since antiquity. Even when the Greek translators sought a translation for the Hebrew term machashefa, like don't let a witch live, they chose the term in Greek pharmakus, literally poisoner, and the term veneficus was often used right alongside maleficum for witch and witchcraft. Thus, poison and sorcery and witchcraft have always been linked to some degree in the Western imaginary. And, of course, Peter of Abano wrote one of the most extensive books in the Middle Ages on poison, De Venenis, perhaps one of the greatest textbooks on poisons in history. This book is divided into 6 parts: the classifications of poisons, how poisons act, how to protect against them, the effects and cures of specific poisons, and the question of the bezoar. Yeah, the bezoar. This is a compound allegedly used to cure all poisonings. It's kind of a panacea for poisons. For Peter, poisons can be induced through any of the senses, including sight, such as when the basilisk kills by sight. It can be induced through touch, as when certain fishes paralyze fishermen. This might be a case of, I don't know, electric eels or something. And poisons operate either through creating humoral deficiency or overdose, or through some specific form captured from the astral rays by which they directly harm or kill. Now, he admits that these astrally induced specific forms are difficult to ascertain, but experience over time actually does reveal their nature, just as you can reveal the nature of specific occult powers of gems, herbs, and metals. How poisons affect the body isn't clear, but Peter is surprisingly antinomian in that he simply doesn't follow Avicenna in his cortical theory of poisoning. That is to say that the heart actually attracts and then distributes poisons through the body. It's one of the many theories of poisoning in the Middle Ages, probably the dominant one. Many of his cures are frankly just basically talismanic in nature, specifically images and gems, especially emeralds are thought to act as the ideal antidote in most cases, though he also suggests the classic range of purgatives and the classic sucking at the site of an injection of poison at the wound. One of the more interesting poisons that he mentions is the bite of a fasting person, along with various potion-like cures that he enumerates in the book. Perhaps most interesting is his discussion of the bezoar, or the panacea, by which it's said to cure any case of poisoning at all. Specifically, Peters wonders if the famed theriac, a ancient/medieval compound made from everything including opium, myrrh, saffron, ginger, cinnamon, castor, along with up to everything including the dried flesh of animals, is in fact the bezoar, that is to say, the cure-all for all poisons. But he is pretty skeptical and actually does side with Galen that each poison probably requires some specific cure, though he thinks that it is possible to create the compound of the theriac and it probably would have some therapeutic use. In fact, after the end of the book, there's a whole appendix about this, and it's not clear if it's written by Peter at all. Lastly, he wonders if it would be possible to create a kind of timed poison, one that could be administered but would only in fact act at a future moment. But for whatever reason, he never returns to this question. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting poisons out there you could use these days, including radioactive poisons, injected with an umbrella or something. As I mentioned, it seemed that this book on poison was actually dedicated to John the 22nd, a pope who would himself radically attack the magical arts and alchemy more than any pope hitherto. That's of course salient because along with the works mentioned, Peter of Abano is of course associated with necromancy. That is to say, influential books of spiritual and demonic magic, including the Elucidarium Necromanticum, the Annulorum Experimenta, and the famed Heptameron. Now, I've done an entire episode on the Elucidarium Necromanticum and the Heptameron if you want to really dive deeper into this foundational text of Western spiritual/demonic magic. But assuming that the two texts name here, or the three texts name here, are the same ones that have come down to us with those names, and frankly, that's often a substantial assumption to make when it comes to the history of magical manuscripts and grimoires, the problem here is thinking that both the Elucidarium Necromanticum and the Heptameron are themselves two distinct texts. In fact, they are very strongly genetically related. That is to say, the Elucidarium Necromanticum is actually the genetic ancestor to the Heptameron, and in the end are actually both quite similar. Again, if you want to really get into these, you can check out my deeper dive on that episode for more information. Why what is apparently one family of texts is actually treated as two distinct texts is a bit mysterious to me, but there it stands. For what it's worth, the Heptameron seems to first appear in a printed edition in 1559 and is a system of magic whereby a complex magical circle is created in which a range of spiritual creatures with various powers are summoned through magical rituals, such that the power and knowledge of those beings can be elicited. Now, I should say here that earlier editions of this text make them generically spirits, sometimes not even good spirits, but by the Heptameron, they're kind of whitewashed into angels. Most of the texts begin by providing a rather comprehensive interlocking system of correspondences between various cycles of time, such as the hours of the day and the night, the days of the week, and the seasons of the year, and the various registers of spiritual creatures, their names, sigils, sympathetic incenses, and their respective appearance and powers. These are all employed to create a complex, multi-tiered magical circle given the aim of the magus and the various entities which can accomplish that aim and their appointed times. Here, a range of angels, demons, and celestial spirits can all be invoked once the proper calculation is made, and this sort of reminds me of something like a vast supernatural lock with the various tumblers falling into place to make this magic work. The text then turns its attention to the precise rituals, especially suffumigation, exorcisms, and incantations, along with the vestments that one has to wear by which these beings are summoned. The magus and their team, you have support staff here. Necromancy is a team sport. Go necromancy. They're all set within the magical circle and become surrounded by a virtual retinue of absolutely frightening beings who, if the rituals and the purifications succeed, can be bent to the will of the magus depending on the virtue of the power of the beings being invoked, obviously. Though, to be clear, this is no easy task. Such beings use powerful illusions in an attempt to test the mettle of the necromantic team, trying to force them out of the protective circle to render them asunder, I suppose. That printed edition of 1559 is actually part of the collected works of Heinricus Cornelius Agrippa, along with a grab bag of other magical manuals like the Ars Notoria and other kinds of texts, and I suspect that Agrippa himself would have had a very low opinion of most of those books. But these magical manuals were collected as an appendix to Agrippa's collected works through several printings, no doubt serving to greatly distort his own philosophical legacy and very likely cementing Peter of Abano's. The second major text associated with Peter of Abano is the Annulorum Experimenta, a text in the larger literature that deals with the production of magical rings. This text relies on the astrological notion that the moon passes through 28 mansions or divisions through the night sky, each of these divisions providing a kind of lunar radiation for the production of a ring, or in some cases several different kinds of rings, often in precious metals with strips of parchment attached to them, imbued with various nomina barbara or magical words. These rings are taken to a specific location and activated, as it were, with various types of incantations, with spit, with incense, and other kinds of things. In general, these rings create a range of illusions, like making dragons appear. Also, they do the common stock of medieval necromantic magic, such as making one invisible, detecting when you've been robbed, or specifically detecting the thieves that have robbed you, and turning coins into ants. But not putting coins back into your pockets, which is what Peter of Abano was alleged to be able to do. Now, a recent article on these texts vis-a-vis Abano by Budæus pointed out that there are conspicuous errors in the astrology, making it pretty unlikely that Abano would have written this because he was a real expert in astrology, and thus this casts real doubt on his authorship of this text. Indeed, neither the text of the Heptameron or the elucidation of necromancy were attributed to Abano until centuries after his death, to be honest. Further, they neither read like Abano's Latin, either in form, style, or content, in my opinion. But I'm going to come back to the Annulorum Experimenta for a future episode on magical rings more generally, so stay tuned for that. Thus, I do suspect that we can agree with Thorndike that their attribution to the second Aristotle, or Peter of Abano, is probably spurious. I don't think he wrote these books. Further, that doesn't mean that a Peter of Abano doesn't have an important place to play in the history of Western esotericism. His rather subtle positioning is a key marker in how medieval intellectuals navigated serious questions about the nature of power, of magic and incantations and astrology. That subtlety means that Abano remains something of a cipher. Recall how he stated that the incantations of the Ars Notoria were in fact effective? Well, he would later disclaim that position in his great astrological tracts, the Lucidator. What are we supposed to make of that exactly? Did he change his mind? Is he dissimulating? Is he engaging in esoteric writing? What was Abano's true position? I suspect that very ambiguity, along with his works on poison, not to mention physiognomy and especially geomancy, which I didn't even cover in this episode, mean that Peter of Abano has entered into the funhouse room of mirrors that is the history of Western magic and esotericism. The literature on Peter of Abano has exploded in the past couple of decades, though unfortunately a lot of it remains highly specialized and difficult to access for solo English readers. A 2013 collection of essays by Boudet, Collier, and Velparot is among the most impressive, wonderful starting place for contemporary folks interested in Peter of Abano studies, especially for his place in the history of magic, but it's mostly in French and it's published by Sismel. Sismel is doing the most important publications on medieval magic these days, but most of that work is being done in French and Italian, especially in terms of Peter of Abano or just grimoire studies more generally. Campani of Agrippa scholarship fame has also published a very important study of Differentia 156, though it's also in Italian. Matthew Klem's Medical Anthropology in the Late Middle Ages is the most important recent study of Abano in English, and I would say that Chapter 5 on Incantations is absolutely fantastic. The book is fantastic and well worth studying if you're interested in Abano and you only read English, but it's still highly specialized. It's also published by de Gruyter, and that's all become assimilated to the Brill Borg monster So you got to pay for it in kidneys. Of course, Joseph Peterson has the best edition out there of the Heptameron, and I'm always excited to promote his fine work. The Annulorum Experimenta also apparently has a recent translation by Regulus Hess by Hadean Press, and I always like their works, so it's also well worth checking out. Of course, much, much more on the history of magic and the colorful characters in that history to come. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.